The first steel rib was a cold, curved promise of an impossible task. Elias braced his boots against the frozen incline, his breath pluming in the thin autumn air, and heaved. The galvanized metal, 16 feet of arching steel, slid a few inches up the wooden ramp he'd built against the side of the hill, its edge scraping a high, thin complaint against the wood. It weighed 120 pounds, and it was the first of 36. Beside him, Boreas, the old Newfoundland whose life had been entwined with this land long before Elias was born, shifted his great black weight and let out a quiet sigh, his intelligent eyes fixed on the cabin below. The dog did not question the labor, he only witnessed it. Inside the small log cabin his grandfather had built with his own hands, a leather-bound journal lay open on the table. The page showed a detailed cross-section, penned in his grandfather's spidery, precise hand. The familiar shape of the cabin, and then, floating 3 feet outside it on all sides, the smooth, parabolic curve of a Quonset hut. In the margin, a simple annotation. Air is the best blanket, if you can keep it still. It was this principle, this quiet and radical idea, that drove Elias up the hill, day after day, hauling the disassembled pieces of the structure he'd spent his entire inheritance on. He had $1,800 from the sale of his grandfather's truck, and he'd spent $1,750 of it on a surplus military Quonset, 30 feet wide and 60 feet long, delivered in stacked pallets to the bottom of his property. The work was a meditation, a slow and deliberate argument against the grief that had settled in his bones since the old man's passing in the spring. Each motion was a word in a sentence he could not speak. The digging of the footings, a full foot into the permafrost line, was a rejection of despair. The mixing of the concrete by hand in a wheelbarrow, the gravel and sand and cement turning into a heavy, uniform gray, was an act of faith. He did not think about the coming winter in terms of fear, but in terms of a deadline. He had a plan. It was during the pouring of the western footing that Mr. Abernathy first stopped his pickup on the track below. Abernathy was a man made of corded muscle and 60 years of hard winters, his face a road map of every blizzard and drought the valley had endured. He leaned on the door of his truck, chewing on a piece of straw, his gaze traveling from the neat stacks of steel panels to the strange concrete trench surrounding the perfectly good cabin. "What in God's name are you doing, son?" Abernathy's voice was not unkind, but it was heavy with the certainty of a man who knew the way things were done. Elias straightened his back, the muscles screaming a protest. He wiped a smear of concrete dust from his brow with the back of his glove. "Building a shell." Abernathy squinted, as if a different angle might make sense of the scene. "A shell? You're building a barn around your house?" "An overframe," Elias said, using his grandfather's term, "for insulation." Abernathy took the straw from his mouth and pointed with it. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You think a tin can is going to keep you warmer than 3-foot logs? That thing's a wind tunnel, a snow trap. Wait until the first heavy snow. The load on that arch will be 10,000 pounds. It'll collapse and crush you and that good dog in your sleep. What was your granddad thinking letting you waste your money on this?" Elias didn't mention the journals. He didn't explain the principle of the thermal air gap, the way the outer shell would take the brunt of the wind chill, leaving the captured air between the two structures as a buffer. The quiet, still air. His grandfather's words. He just looked at the older man, his expression calm. "It'll work." Abernathy shook his head, a gesture of profound pity. He got back in his truck, the engine turning over with a tired rumble. "Don't say I didn't warn you, boy." The truck kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled away. Elias watched it go, then turned back to his work, plunging the shovel back into the wet concrete. Boreas nudged a cold, wet nose into his hand, then settled back down. His duty as a silent supporter resumed. The town, when he had to go for supplies, was a chorus of quieter but no less certain skepticism. Mrs. Gable, who ran the general store, would press a loaf of bread into his hands and look at him with worried, maternal eyes. "Elias, honey, people are talking. Mayor Thompson is saying it's an eyesore. Are you doing all right? Since your grandfather..." She left the question hanging in the air, thick with the scent of cinnamon and sawdust. "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable. Thank you for the bread." He would pay for his sack of flour and nails, his movements economical and precise, and leave before the questions could take deeper root. He knew what they thought. They saw a grieving young man, barely 20, alone in the world, squandering his meager inheritance on a bizarre folly. They saw madness born of loss. He saw a plan. He saw survival. He began assembling the ribs on the ground, 2 of the curved sections bolted together to form a single arch. 288 bolts, each one tightened by hand with a wrench until his knuckles were raw and his shoulders ached with a fire that never quite went out. The repetitive motion became a rhythm. Insert bolt, thread nut, tighten, repeat. The clang of the wrench on the steel was the only music on the hill. Boreas would watch, occasionally twitching an ear at a particularly loud sound, but he never strayed. He was an anchor of calm in a sea of effort. One afternoon, as he was using a rope and a pulley system rigged to a tall pine to hoist the first completed arch into place on its footing, a different vehicle stopped on the road. It was a small, practical car, and from it emerged Clara, Mr. Abernathy's daughter. She was a librarian in the town, a quiet woman with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than most. She carried a small basket. She didn't call out. She simply walked up the path and stood a respectful distance away, watching as he strained against the rope, the massive steel arch rising slowly, agonizingly, into the sky. It swayed, a huge metallic skeleton against the deepening blue. He secured the rope, his muscles trembling with the effort, and finally turned to her. "My father said you were building something strange," she said. Her voice was calm, without the edge of judgment he was used to. "He's not wrong," Elias replied, his breathing still heavy. She gestured to the basket. "I brought you some stew. I figured you might not be stopping to cook much." She set it down on a clean patch of grass. "Why this shape? The curve?" It was the first time anyone had asked a question born of curiosity rather than ridicule. He looked from her face to the arch, now silhouetted against the sky. "The wind," he said simply. "A flat wall fights the wind. A curve lets it slide over. It's stronger because it doesn't fight." She nodded slowly, considering this. Her eyes went to the cabin, then to the arch looming over it. "An overframe," she said, using his word, "to keep the air still." Elias felt a flicker of surprise. He hadn't told her that. He'd only told her father he was building a shell. "My father complains a lot," she explained with a small smile. "But he repeats everything. He said you were trying to insulate with it. I found a book at the library, an old engineering text. It talked about thermal envelopes. It's not a new idea, just an uncommon one." He said nothing, just watched her. She was not mocking him. She was validating him. "I hope it works," she said, her smile genuine. She turned to leave. "Please eat the stew before it gets cold." He watched her walk back to her car, a small point of warmth in his vast, lonely project. That night, sitting by the fire, he ate the stew. It was rich with beef and potatoes, and it tasted like kindness. Boreas lay with his head on Elias's knee, and together they looked at the journal. On the page, his grandfather had sketched the wind currents flowing over the parabolic dome, the lines smooth and unbroken. Below, he'd sketched the currents hitting the flat-faced, gabled roof of a traditional cabin, the lines breaking into chaotic eddies and vortices. "Do not fight the mountain," the old man had written. "Let it guide you." Elias ran a hand over the page, the calluses on his fingers rasping against the old paper. He had 29 more arches to raise. The nights were getting colder. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by the calendar but by the slow, relentless progress on the hill. The 36 ribs were finally raised, a skeletal cathedral enclosing the small log home. They stood in perfect parallel, a testament to the precision of his grandfather's calculations and the endurance of his own body. His hands, once merely strong, were now maps of the work. The knuckles were swollen, the palms thick with calluses that sometimes split and bled, forcing him to stop and wrap them in clean rags. At night, he would soak them in hot water and salt, the sting a sharp reminder of the day's labor. Boreas would sit with him, resting his heavy head on the edge of the basin, his dark eyes full of a deep, ancient sympathy. He was a witness to the pain, a partner in the exhaustion. The next phase was the sheeting. Hundreds of corrugated steel panels had to be lifted, positioned, and screwed into the ribs. He devised a system with ropes and a small hand-cranked winch, but it was still a grueling, one-man operation. He'd haul a panel up, wrestling with its unwieldy size as the wind tried to tear it from his grasp. Then, perched precariously on a ladder, he would drill the self-tapping screws into the steel frame, the high-pitched whine of the drill echoing across the valley. Each panel overlapped the last by exactly 6 inches, a detail stressed repeatedly in the journals. The seams are the weakness. Overlap, seal, respect the seams. The town's ambient mockery continued. Mayor Thompson, on a drive to inspect a new bridge, stopped and declared it a public nuisance, a monstrosity of sheet metal. He threatened citations, though on what grounds he couldn't say. The structure was on Elias's own land, far from the town proper. It was a threat to aesthetics, not safety, at least in the mayor's view. Elias simply ignored him, continuing to drill screws as the mayor fumed below. The only response was the steady, rhythmic whine of his work. Clara came again, this time with a thermos of hot coffee and a pair of thick leather work gloves. "I saw your hands at the store," she said by way of explanation. He accepted them with a quiet nod of thanks. The new gloves were stiff, but they protected his battered skin. They watched together as he fixed another panel in place, the silver of the metal catching the low autumn sun. The cabin was slowly disappearing inside the metallic cocoon. "It's like you're building a ship," she mused, "or an ark." "Just a house," he said, but he understood what she meant. It felt monumental, a singular act of preparation against a coming flood. The end walls were the final major piece of construction. He framed them with wood, leaving openings for the cabin's existing front door and a single large window on the southern face. He sheathed the wooden frames in the same corrugated steel, cutting the pieces with a pair of metal snips until his forearms burned. He built a simple, sturdy door for the outer shell, fitting it with a heavy barn latch. When he finally closed it for the first time, the sound was a deep, satisfying thud. He was inside. The space between the cabin and the shell was strange and resonant. It was like standing in a cave of steel. His footsteps echoed. The air was still, protected from the constant breeze that scoured the hillside. It already felt different, a zone of calm. He walked the perimeter of his cabin, now an interior structure, and ran his hand along the familiar, rough-hewn logs. He had not damaged his grandfather's work. He had shielded it. He spent the last of his money on sealant for the seams and rock wool insulation, which he packed into the base of the shell where it met the concrete footings. Every gap, every potential leak of precious still air was addressed. His grandfather's journal was his Bible. Every instruction followed to the letter. The cold is a patient thief. It will find every crack you leave for it. By the first week of November, it was finished. The structure dominated the hillside, a long silver half-cylinder that gleamed in the pale light. It was alien, industrial, and utterly out of place among the pines and traditional log homes of the valley. From the town, it was an inexplicable scar on the landscape. To Elias, it was a fortress. The first snow came, a light dusting that outlined the world in white. Abernathy drove by, slowed his truck, and shook his head. The snow wasn't heavy enough to test the load-bearing capacity of the arch, but his expression was clear. Just you wait. Elias began his winter preparations in earnest. He had 10 cords of wood, split and stacked neatly against the north wall of the cabin, now safely inside the shell. This was his most significant departure from local custom. Everyone else stacked their wood outside, exposed to the elements, where it could be buried in snow or covered in ice. His wood was dry and protected. He installed 2 thermometers, as his grandfather's notes instructed. One was nailed to a pine tree 50 feet from the shell, exposed to the open air. The second he hung in the middle of the air gap, suspended on a wire from the ceiling of the Quonset. The third was the old mercury thermometer that had always hung inside the cabin, next to the fireplace. He started a new journal, a companion to his grandfather's, and on the first page he drew 3 columns: outside, gap, cabin. The temperatures began to drop. The first readings were promising. On a night when the outside thermometer read 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the air in the gap held at 34 degrees. Inside the cabin, with a small banked fire, it was a comfortable 65 degrees. He used less than half the wood he would have needed in previous years to maintain that temperature. He recorded the numbers meticulously. Boreas seemed to appreciate the change, no longer needing to curl into a tight ball for warmth, instead stretching out on the rug before the hearth, his heavy sighs full of contentment. Clara brought him a copy of a book on Arctic architecture. They sat at his small table, the journal and the library book side by side. He showed her his grandfather's drawings, the elegant lines depicting airflow and thermal dynamics. He spoke more than he had in months, explaining the concepts with a quiet confidence that surprised even himself. "He wasn't just a carpenter," Clara said, her finger tracing one of the diagrams. "He was an engineer." "He just paid attention," Elias said. He watched the snow pile up. He watched where the wind scoured the trees bare. He learned from the world. It was the last week of November when the warnings began. The sky took on a strange, bruised purple color at the horizon. The wind, which had been a constant, predictable presence from the northwest, died completely. The silence was unnerving. Abernathy's truck appeared at the bottom of the hill, and this time he got out and walked all the way to the outer door. His face was grim. "We're in for it, son," he said, his earlier mockery gone, replaced by the sober gravity of a man who knows a real threat. "The barometer is falling faster than I've ever seen. The radio is calling it a once-in-a-generation blizzard. They're saying 3 days of it, maybe more. You sure about this contraption?" He kicked at the steel wall. "I am," Elias said. Abernathy looked past him into the sheltered space at the neatly stacked wood. He grunted. Well, your woodpile is in better shape than mine. Good luck, boy. You'll need it. He turned and left, his shoulders hunched against a cold that was not yet here, but was coming. That night, Elias did his final checks. He brought in extra buckets of water from the well. He filled the wood box inside the cabin to the brim. He cooked a large pot of stew, enough for days. Boreas paced, whining softly, his animal senses alive with the atmospheric pressure change. Elias sat with him, stroking his thick fur. "It's all right, old man," he murmured. "We're ready." The first flakes began to fall just after dusk, soft and lazy. But by midnight, the world had disappeared into a howling vortex of white. The wind came, a physical wall of force that slammed into the north side of the shell. Elias stood in the air gap, listening. Outside, the storm was a screaming fury, a sound he knew well from every other winter of his life. It was the sound of nature trying to tear the world apart. But inside the shell, the scream was muted to a deep, resonant roar, the sound of a distant ocean. The steel vibrated under the assault, a low hum that passed through the soles of his boots. The structure held. It did not fight the wind, it shed it. The curve was doing its work. He went back inside the cabin. He closed the thick wooden door, and the roar faded to a whisper. The silence was profound. The only sounds were the crackle of the small fire in the hearth and the gentle breathing of the old dog at his feet. He checked the thermometers. Outside, the mercury was plummeting. He couldn't see the gauge through the swirling snow, but he knew the feel of it. He checked the one in the gap. It read 19 degrees Fahrenheit. He looked at the one on the cabin wall. It read 61 degrees. A small, efficient fire, and the cabin was holding at 61 degrees. He wrote the numbers in his journal with a steady hand. Grandfather was right. For 2 days, the world ceased to exist beyond his walls. Snow piled up against the shell, burying it, insulating it further. The wind never stopped. He kept the fire small, fed it a few logs every few hours. The temperature inside the cabin never dropped below 60. He ate stew, read his grandfather's journals again, and watched the snow collect on the sill of the single south-facing window in the outer shell, the only portal to the outside world. Boreas slept, secure and warm, the storm a forgotten rumor beyond their sanctuary. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally began to subside. The silence it left behind was heavier than the noise had been. It was then that he heard it, a faint, desperate pounding. It wasn't at the cabin door, it was at the outer shell. He pulled on his coat and boots, took a lantern, and walked into the echoing space of the air gap. The pounding came again, weaker this time. "Hello?" he called out. "Help! Please, help us!" The voice was muffled, hoarse with cold. He pulled at the heavy outer door. It wouldn't budge. A massive drift had buried it. He put his shoulder into it, heaving with all his strength. It moved an inch, then 2. Snow poured in. He pushed again and again, finally creating an opening just wide enough to squeeze through. The figure that fell inside was caked in snow, barely recognizable as a human being. It was Mr. Abernathy. His face was pale, his lips blue, ice clinging to his eyebrows and beard. He was shivering violently. "My chimney," he gasped, his teeth chattering. "The wind, it took the whole top of it. The house is as cold as a tomb. Clara, my wife, they're freezing." "Bring them here," Elias said, his voice calm and even. He helped Abernathy back to his feet. The older man stared, his eyes wide with disbelief, into the space Elias had built. He saw the protected cabin, the dry wood, felt the absence of the wind that had been trying to kill him for 3 days. He felt the air, cold but not brutally so, still and calm. He simply nodded, a man stripped of all his certainty, and stumbled back out into the snow. Elias went back to the cabin and stoked the fire, putting a large kettle of water on to boil. Boreas stood, a low rumble in his chest, sensing the intrusion of strangers. Elias quieted him with a hand on his head. "It's okay. They need help." Abernathy returned 20 minutes later with Clara and his wife, both wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces etched with fear and cold. Elias led them into the cabin. The moment they crossed the threshold, they stopped, stunned. The warmth hit them like a physical blow. It was a deep, gentle, life-giving warmth. Mrs. Abernathy began to cry, silent tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. Clara looked at Elias, her eyes saying more than words ever could. "The whole town is dark," Abernathy said, his voice trembling as he held his hands out to the fire. "Power lines are down everywhere. No one has heat, no one. We saw your light. It was the only light in the whole valley." They were the first, but not the last. Word must have spread through some desperate, half-frozen chain of survival. An hour later, more pounding at the outer door. It was the Gable family, their 2 small children wrapped in their arms. Mrs. Gable looked at Elias, her face a mixture of awe and shame. "We were so cold," she whispered. He just nodded and led them in, finding a place for the children on the rug near the fire where Boreas, after a cautionary sniff, accepted them with a gentle lick on the hand. By nightfall, his cabin held 22 people. Mayor Thompson was the last to arrive, his pride overcome by the primal need for warmth for his wife and elderly mother. He stood, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards of the house he had called a monstrosity, unable to meet Elias's gaze. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, its needle holding steady at 61 degrees. He looked at the small, efficient fire. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, their bodies slowly unthawing, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and wonder. Elias moved among them, handing out cups of hot water and bowls of stew. He said little, his actions speaking for him. He was not a savior. He was just a man who had listened to his grandfather. He had prepared. His quiet persistence, his solitary labor, the thing they had all mocked as madness, had become their shelter. In the warmth of the small log cabin, surrounded by the silent, protective embrace of the steel shell, the community huddled together and survived the great storm. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, the world it revealed was unrecognizable. The snow was piled in drifts 20 feet high, burying cars and homes, sculpting the landscape into a smooth, white desert. The sun on it was blinding. The silence was absolute. For another 2 days, the valley remained cut off, but inside the cabin there was warmth and food. The 22 survivors shared stories, cared for one another, and watched Elias with a new and profound respect. Mr. Abernathy was the first to speak what everyone was thinking. He stood in the air gap, looking up at the arch of the steel roof where the immense weight of the snow should have crushed it. But the curve, designed to shed the wind, had also distributed the load. The structure was sound. He ran a hand over a steel rib, then turned to Elias. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out rough, as if they were new to his tongue. "Everything I said. I was a fool. Your grandfather, he was a genius. And you listened." It was more than an apology. It was a confession, a conversion. Mayor Thompson, who had spent 2 days in quiet observation, cleared his throat. "When the plows get through," he announced to the small group, "the town will provide whatever resources you need, Elias. Lumber, equipment. We need to understand this. We need more of these." The name stuck. Over the next few years, they became known as Elias Shells. The first summer after the blizzard, Abernathy, with Elias's quiet guidance, built one over his own home. He didn't have the journals, but he had the living example, and he had the boy he now looked upon as a teacher. 2 other families followed suit. The strange, silver half-cylinders began to dot the valley, no longer symbols of eccentricity, but of wisdom and foresight. People would stop by Elias's cabin, not to stare, but to ask questions. They would bring him gifts, jars of preserves, a side of venison, a newly sharpened axe. He would accept them with a quiet nod, and if they asked, he would show them the journals, letting his grandfather's careful words and drawings explain the elegant science of survival. Years passed. The deep quiet of Elias's life was filled with the gentle presence of Clara. They married in the small-town church, the reception held on the grass beside the cabin and its shell. Their life together was woven into the fabric of the place. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who grew up playing in the strange, echoing space between the walls, their laughter a new kind of music in the steel cathedral. Elias remained a man of few words, but his silence was now understood not as aloofness, but as depth. He was the one people sought out when the sky looked strange, or when a foundation needed to be laid. He never offered advice unasked, but when he spoke, people listened. Boreas grew old. His great black muzzle turned gray, his movements slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping by the hearth, the same hearth where he had weathered the great storm. His sight began to fail, but he could always find his way to Elias's hand. One cool autumn morning, 17 years after the shell was built, the old dog did not wake up. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, in the warmth and safety of the home he had guarded so faithfully. Elias carried his friend's heavy body up the hill and buried him beneath the tall pine where he had rigged the pulley to raise the first arch. He carved a simple stone marker with the dog's name and a single date: Boreas, a loyal witness. He and Clara stood there for a long time, his hand on her shoulder, the silence full of a shared and gentle grief. Elias lived a long and full life. He filled new journals with his own observations, adding to the knowledge his grandfather had passed down. He taught his son how to read the weather in the clouds and how to respect the grain of wood. He taught his daughter how to find north by the stars and how to be patient. He grew old in the valley, a quiet patriarch, his legacy not just in the silver shells that protected his neighbors, but in the quiet wisdom he embodied. He died in his 87th year, in the same bed, in the same warm cabin. The fire was burning low in the hearth. Clara had passed a few years before, and his children were with him. His passing was like Boreas's, a peaceful drift into a final, quiet sleep. The entire valley came to his funeral. They buried him on the hill beside Clara, a short distance from the pine tree that marked Boreas's grave. Mr. Abernathy's grandson, now a man himself, spoke of how Elias had saved his family. Mayor Thompson's daughter spoke of his quiet strength and generosity. The cabin and its shell were left to the town, preserved as a historical landmark. Tourists and engineering students would come to see it, to marvel at the simple, elegant solution that had saved a community. A bronze plaque was affixed to the outer door. It read, "The Elias Shell, built by Elias Thorne, 1952. Following the designs of his grandfather, Thomas Thorne. In the great blizzard of '52, this structure gave shelter and saved the lives of 22 people. It stands as a monument to unconventional wisdom, quiet persistence, and the knowledge that true strength does not fight the storm, but yields to it." The wind knows the strongest shape. Through the passing decades, the steel shell weathered from a bright silver to a soft, mottled gray, blending into the stone and bark of the mountain. It stood firm against 100 winters, a silent, curving testament on the hill. It was no longer a strange folly or even a historical site. It was simply part of the landscape, as enduring and as natural as the pines that grew around it. A permanent echo of a quiet man who had listened to the wind, and in doing so, had built a home that could not be broken.